You see, if you go back into the previous chapter, chapter 6, verse 13, God made his promises to Abraham. And it actually says in this 13th verse of chapter 6, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, that is God, saying, surely I will bless you and give you many descendants. And so Abraham received what was promised. So it is quite significant that here, what it's saying in chapter 7, verse 6, is that Melchizedek, who had no record of his genealogy, yet collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him, Abraham, who had the promises. You know, this does bring something out here, that there are 10 specific issues here. That with Melchizedek, he's only mentioned in 3 books of the Bible. Not only that, but very strangely, when you study Scripture, you'll find out that there is more written of Melchizedek in the New Testament than in the Old. That's surprising, because the Old is the history. We recognize the third thing, and there's 10 points here. The third is that Melchizedek lived at the same time as Abraham. Now, the other thing, and this does here come out, because in verse 3, when Paul is saying that he had no father or mother, had no genealogy, it's very interesting. The more you study Scripture, the more you find out that the Jews were absolutely emphatic about genealogy. Right throughout, I mean, even in the New Testament, you get the genealogy of Jesus. And right through the Old Testament, I know the first time I read the Bible through from one side to the other, I was shocked by the genealogies, the lists and lists and lists. And yet, here Paul says that this is the only one who has no genealogy, not Melchizedek. So this puts him as something different. The second thing is that although he did not descend from the line of the priesthood, and remember, under the law, you had the line of the priests with their genealogies, it actually indicates that without that genealogy, he was still referred to as a priest, and a priest without end. We'll come on to that in a moment. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that when you move on from here, it says in verse 5, the law required the descendants of Levi to collect a tenth from the other tribes, although the other tribes are descended from Abraham. This man didn't trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the man who already had God's blessing. So this Melchizedek had a blessing greater than Abraham. It says in verse 7, without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In verse 8, you get something quite intriguing. In this particular case, the tenth is collected by men who die. But it's interesting, but it's those who are living that actually give the tenth. So in verse 9, one might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek made Abraham, Levi was still part of the ancestry. Now, this is this is becoming something quite interesting here, because if you move on to verse 11, what you see is this: perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood on the basis of the law. Now, if that is the case, that through the Levitical priesthood, they could confer upon the people a sinlessness, a blessing, an absolution from sin, because the priests made the offering for sin for the people. So, if this was the case, why did we need to replace the priesthood, which we're going to come to in a moment? Because he says, as Paul says, still in verse 11 here, if the law was given to the people, and that law covered sin, why was there still need for another priest, and one who is in the order of Melchizedek? It's very interesting. So that the prophecy is that there would come another priest who would be like Melchizedek. You know, it's very interesting, because the more that you look at this, the more we study it, and the more in the past I have studied it, we must come to the conclusion that Melchizedek, because he was without genealogy, without father and mother, and apparently didn't die because he's a priest forever, he could only have been a type of Jesus. In fact, some suggest that he was a pre-incarnation of Jesus, because there are two people in the Old Testament who are very unusual. One is Melchizedek, because the only person who could fulfill the role of Melchizedek was to be Jesus. The second is the one with whom Jacob wrestled. Because you know, when Jacob was afraid of his brother trying to meet Esau, and you remember he went apart, and in the night he met with this angelic visitor, and the angelic visitor wrestled with him through the night, and in the end neither could prevail, but that visitor touched Jacob's thigh in order that it ended the fight, but he also blessed him and said, as a prince, you have power with God and with men, and have prevailed even with God. Now, that took place in that battle in the night. So there are two clear people, and one can only assume, and I'm not alone in saying this, that both must have been in some way a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus. Now that opens up a whole lot that I'm going to have to deal with later.